What's up, everybody? Tim Humphreys here, and today I'm going to teach you guys how to slow-mo your GoPro footage like a boss, or any footage in general. What is all this high frame rate, slow motion, all this jargon that everyone's talking about? It's all right here on the GoPro. You see right here how it says FPS 30? That is short for frames per second. We have all sorts of options between 24 and 240 depending on what frame size you're filming. Let's say 120 frames a second. This guy every second shoots 120 images. Why that is important and why we need so many of them. It's kind of an abstract concept when you think about it on the computer, so I'm going to use some cards to explain it. All this stuff it's just basic concepts. I'm not going to teach you, do this, do that. I'm just trying to give like a kind of a broad overview and sort of help visualize what you can't really see in your video editor. Like you can't really see your video editor dropping the frames or where every frame's going, or if it's skipping them, what it exports to you. You can only see how the video plays. So to start off, I have right here a little diagram. We have 29.97 frames per second, or 30p footage, so that's what we filmed off the camera at 30 frames a second, and we put that in a 30p timeline. So when we drop 30p footage in a 30p timeline, obviously we get the frames playing sequentially in order. Everything's nice. Same thing if you film with 24p, 23.98 otherwise. You film that in 24p and put it in a 24p timeline. You see it sequentially all the way through, and everything is good. Let's say you put 24p into a 30p timeline. So for every second of video footage, there's 24 frames, but your editor has 30 slots for a frame to be viewed every second. So what that means is that it'll play through your frames, but then at every fourth frame it has to duplicate one to fill in the gaps. So what happens is your video plays, and then it stutters for a second because there's a duplicate, and you see the same thing for 2 video frame slots, and then it continues for 4 more frames, and then it stutters. So when you see it in real time, it goes and stops and goes and stops and goes and stops. So yeah, 24p into a 30p timeline is really not ideal. Whenever your video editor has to create frames, basically to fill the gaps in, that means that you don't have enough to fill it in, and that's the worst possible look in my opinion. I think the footage looks the choppiest when it's duplicating frames versus when you have more and it has to drop a few. And we'll get into that right here. So what if we put 30p footage into a 24p timeline? So when you put 30p footage into a 24p timeline, it'll play the first 4 frames right here, and then it skips the 5th frame, and it'll play 6, 7, 8, 9, skip the 10th here, and then 11, and so on. Now, this isn't exactly ideal, but it looks better than when it has to duplicate frames. Because this will go and then it'll have a quick gap. It'll jump real quick, and I think the jump is a little bit less noticeable than the duplicate frame where it stops. That's just my opinion. I mean, you can see it, take a look at it, and make the decision for yourself. Alright, now let's get into a few more different types of frame rates and stuff like that. Basically your sequence settings really aren't ever going to be anything other than 30, 24, maybe 60 sometimes. depending on where the media is going to. So yeah, let's say if we put 60p footage into a 30 frame a second timeline, every other frame will be skipped. So that means you'll play frame 1, skip 2, play 3, skip 4, play 5, skip 6. And this will play smoothly, because if you notice, every other frame has been dropped, and there's the same amount that it skips, and it's at an even interval. So it would be the equivalent of if you film something in 30 and put it in a 30 timeline. Same if you drop 90 frames a second into a 30p timeline, it'll play 1, and then skip 2, and then play 5, and then skip 2, play 9, and so on and so on. And the reason these all play smoothly is because, like I said, it doesn't matter how many it has to skip. It is basically there's way more frames than it needs, and it can skip them, and they're even multiples, so it plays nicely. Where you start running into trouble is stuff where it's like 30p into 24p or 24 into 30. Let's take a look down here at this example right here. 48p in a 30p timeline. It'll play. This does something kind of weird where it plays a frame, skips 1, plays 2 frames, skips 1, plays 2 frames, skips, plays 2 frames, and so on until it gets to about the 15th video slot frame in your editor, and then it'll skip 2, and then it'll go back onto this pattern. So depending on how the different frame rates and stuff line up, your options are kind of limited with what you can do with the footage. So like 48p, this would play really nice in a 24p timeline because 48 is double 24. But in 30, it doesn't do the best. It's not the smoothest. But as you start getting into higher and higher frame rates, like 96 frames a second, for example, when you put that into 30p, notice how it kind of looks like this here. So even though it's kind of skipping an extra one every 4th frame, since there's so many of these other ones to fill in all the little gaps, you don't notice the gaps. The gaps aren't as big. So the higher your frame rate, the less that you notice the skipping. It's really, you notice it a lot when the numbers are closer to like 30 or 24. It's all the lower numbers that you really have to be concerned about with that create problems. That's why a lot of people choose to film higher frame rates, is because with all those extra frames, yeah, it's a lot bigger of a file size, but you have a lot more of a safety net and a cushion to work with, and you can do a lot more with the footage, in terms of formatting, applying it to different frame rate time bases, slow-mo, all that good stuff. And then we hit the magical 120 frames a second. And why 120 frames a second is so special is that it is the first number that you reach that is evenly divisible by 30 and 24. So you notice that if you put 120p into a 30p timeline, it'll play a frame, skip 3, play a frame, skip 3. And if you put 120 frames a second into 24p timeline, play a frame, skip 4, play a frame, skip 4, but it does it evenly. So this is the first number you hit. So that's why 120 and 240 are commonly seen frame rates, is because they play really nice with a lot of different settings. So that's why you see those all over the place. So now that you have a good, hopefully visual representation of how frame rates sort of work and how to make them play smoothly, you use this basic theory and you use it as a set of rules when you start applying slow motion to your clips and when you start slowing them down to certain speeds. Because with footage there's only certain numbers that you can actually use. Your video editor lets you type in any number you want, but for every number that works and looks good, there's a lot more numbers that aren't. That's why, again, 120 frames a second is nice, because when you have it in a 30p timeline, you can play it at, this would be 100% speed, or if you played it at 50% speed, it would look kind of like our 60p option. It would skip every other frame. Or you can also play it at 75% speed, and it'll play a frame, skip 2, play a frame, skip 2. So 120 frames a second is nice because you have a lot of different slow-mo options. 25%, 50%, 75% are basically your options. Or with 60p and a 30 frame a second timeline, you really only have 50%. That's it. That's your only option. Anything in between will look choppy. How we arrive at these numbers is pretty easy. You just got to whip out a calculator. I know, you got to do math to edit a freaking video. It sucks. But super easy. You just take your editing time base, so 30p or your 24, and you divide that by your footage frame rate. 30 divided by 120, and we get 0.25, which is a decimal representation of 25%. And 25% is the slowest possible speed that we can put it at, and that's the number right there. That's the number that you're aiming for. Quick, easy calculation. You'll see it's not too difficult. There's not too many different camera frame rates that you'll run into that are super weird and don't match. But you can always divide it up and find your answer, and that's the speed you want to use, and that's what's going to look smooth, and that's what's going to look the best. So, end of the day, we're just trying to make our videos look nice. So yeah, I hope you guys like the nice little infographic I made. Worked super hard on it. I'm going to get into some video clips now and talk a little bit more about just how to slow them down in your video editor, and go over the percent speeds you slow them down to and stuff again. Alright, so I have 3 clips loaded up here in Adobe Premiere. This first one that we have is this little POV frontside 360, and this is shot at 60 frames a second. Here we have this little hand plant shot right here, and that is shot at 80 frames a second. And here we have this little painter pulse sweep 5.0 shot at the Bear Mountain GoPro Park, shot by my boy Lee Stock. That is at 120 frames a second. So our first 60 frame a second video clip that we have, so we're going to take our 30 frames a second for our timeline, and then we're going to divide it by the 60 frames a second that our clip here is playing at. We get 0.5, so that's 50% represented as a decimal. The slowest speed that we can go on this clip is 50% speed. So there's a few ways we can achieve this. We can just right click and go to speed duration and set the speed to 50%. And see, here's where this becomes important, is because you can enter any number you want, fractions, whatever. So it's really up to you to know exactly what speed to play this footage at. Put it to 50%, hit enter. Notice how our clip right here just doubled in size. So let's watch it again. So we got that nice half speed, nice and slow. If we frame through it, every frame is nice and smooth. That's when you do it right. Let's do it wrong for a second. Let's put this at 25% speed, and let's watch it. Notice how it's really not very smooth. It's kind of a bit jittery. And then let's exemplify this even more. Let's maybe set this to 10% speed. So, see what I mean? How when you go below that speed, your video editor actually adds frames in there to compensate for it. So I'm hitting next, 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 and there it finally moves. Next, 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 and then it moves. 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that really exemplifies, making sure that your frames are stacked up correctly and that it's playing smoothly, because otherwise you'll have footage that looks choppy and not good. And you even notice it, let's say if we go back above the lowest speed that we can go, let's say if we go to, I don't know, let's go to 75% speed. It still doesn't look the best, because there's kind of little gaps in between the frames at an uneven amount. So 60 frames a second, you can do some stuff with it, but really 50% is your only option. Here we have this next clip. I said it was running at 80 frames a second. To find out our speed, we take 30, divide that by 80 of the clip, and we get 0.375. So that translates to 37.5% speed, and that's the speed that we need to use for this. Instead of using the other panel, you can go to timer mapping, then speed on this, and then you can use this little add remove keyframe button over here to add a slow-mo keyframe. So we have an in and an out, and then we can just drag these little areas. So this is the area where it ramps out, and then let's hit full slow-mo right there. Then you take this little thing, grab it, and click and drag down. And see here we only get even numbers, so with this it's alright to round up the 0.5%. It'll still look just fine. And then we give it a little bit of smoothing. So you notice as I grab this, it smooths the little transition of the speed out. So, and that's when you get that beautiful, glorious, just nice slow-mo. Boom. See all this stuff flying around. But let's get into this 120 frame a second footage, because we can do a little bit more with this, because it has 3 different options of speeds that we can slow it down to and still have that very nice smooth motion, because we're skipping the same number of frames every time. So let's start with this bad boy. Let's just get her down to let's get it down to 25% speed. So we take our 30 frame a second timeline, divide that by 120, and that gives us 0.25. So 25% is our optimal slowdown speed. So let's look at this right here, and it looks very nice. Hit that 5.0. But also, as per my example earlier, we could change this to 50% speed, and it'll still look nice and smooth with no jittery motion. And we can also change this to 75% speed and still have nice motion. But let's say we change this to something like 35% speed, somewhere in between. Notice that little bit of stutter right there. Notice how pretty much every third frame it jumps a little bit more than the last. So we have a little bit of motion, a little bit of motion, and then big jumps. You know, you just gotta do a little bit of math, bust out the handy dandy calculator, and make sure that your frame rates are on point, and that is how you have the smoothest, butteriest slow motion on the block. That's what it is. So hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial, learned some stuff. Maybe hit me with a follow on the Instagram at Tim Humphreys, and big shout out to all the sponsors. We got GoPro, we got Flow, we got GoPole, shout out to GnarBox, and we got Bolle. Hopefully I'll be seeing you guys posting some epic videos now. Hopefully you learned a thing or two from this nice little tutorial here. Hopefully I'll see you guys on the slopes.